Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin. There's a whole lot of things to talk about this week. Another week in of the Ukrainian counteroffensive against Russia. We have France wanting to join BRICS. We've got things heating up in Serbia and Kosovo in the church. We've got Cyprus. It never gets tired in Cyprus with the that's really kind of where we see the most division of the recognition of the Ukrainian schismatics who continue to be propped up by the ecumenical patriarchs. So we have a lot of big things to talk about today, a little bit of Armenia, Azerbaijan, Caucasoid talk as well. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Yeah, doing great, Conrad. Good to be here. Yeah, I've noticed the news about Ukraine and Russia, at least the conflict in the Zaporozhye region, has really been not stagnant, but actually very active. In fact, the numbers at the moment, I mean, they're in the speculative range, but we're looking at somewhere between 50 and 170 Ukrainian tanks at least destroyed. And this is almost 2 weeks into the actual Zaporozhye offensive. So at this point, overall numbers based on what the Western powers have given Ukraine, we're looking at roughly maybe a fifth, if not a quarter, of all the tanks they were provided are actually confirmed to be destroyed. Footage is being released consecutively, and we are actually getting footage of Leopard 2 tanks, which are probably the second best tank that the Ukrainians are receiving from Western powers, at least in terms of expense and firepower. And we're seeing many of them, at least in the tens, sort of destroyed on the sides of roads by Russian missiles, airplanes, mines, etc. So Russia has been very active actually defending the Zaporozhye front, and Ukraine doesn't seem to have moved in, at least hasn't taken any significant ground. So in fact, the defenses are holding strong, which is, I think, the biggest news of the week is that the status quo is still there. Zaporozhye still technically belongs to Russia, at least part of the oblast.
I mean, at this point, the Ukrainians have barely even broken through, in most places, the first of what I believe are four major lines of Russian defense, which at this point, I believe even Russia had anticipated falling back to their second and third lines at this point in a supposed Ukrainian counteroffensive. And we're seeing not just, like you said, Zaporozhye and southern Donetsk being the kind of real focus. They're pushing in all these directions to make sure that all the front of the Russian military is pinned down to not reinforce, and get a break so that these places that they're really trying to break through and, supposedly cut off the Crimean land bridge so they can't get more support. I mean, they're literally pushing and having even boat and artillery battles in the most flooded region downstream from the Kakhovka Dam just to keep the Russians on the other side of the Dnieper busy. Obviously, they're not going to be able to mount any kind of tank or armored vehicle offensive over that flooded region just yet, but they're even pushing in the woods of the Luhansk region, which we know is no viable region for a actual offensive, but they know that there are troops there positioned along the front line, so they're gonna try to keep them tied down with the artillery and with the, even just the small arms that they've been given from the West. So it's really going all along the front line, but like you said, hundreds of these Western tanks destroyed. The supposed wonder weapons that they were have not been doing their job. Many have said, these were designed for desert warfare, as opposed to, the T-90 being for this type of warfare a much superior tank. I've heard this from a number of military analysts, but in general, it just seems that the offensive is going to end with some kind of, like, we may still see certain Ukrainian figures claim there never was an offensive and that these were all just probing attempts. The offensive was never going to start till we get F-16s or whatever the hell comes next. So yeah, it's definitely it's not coming without some new words from the political side of things as far as new territory, demilitarized zones, sanitary zones, and we're even hearing about from other people. We're hearing that we need to push all the way to Lvov, or certain things. So we're seeing, and of course Lukashenko has been inquiring in onto all of this. So and the sanitary zone stuff ultimately stems from we just saw some new video released from that Belgorod incursion by the supposed Russian Democratic or like Russian People's Forces or whatever the hell they call themselves, and that is one of the reasons why the regions like Kharkov and Sumy have been cited as why we need to immediately establish a sanitary zone, which I'm not quite sure exactly what that means. As far as it seems to be a more diplomatic way of saying that area needs to be demilitarized as opposed to going in and annexing it. But Yeah, I think we're seeing the slowly but surely the next stage of diplomacy play out in the region here.
Yeah, I think just noticing the statements of the governor of the Kherson region, we've mentioned him in previous episodes of Vladimir Saldo. At the moment, he is stating that some sort of new arrangement needs to be set up where Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, Lugansk, these three new oblasts need to be recognized as a certain special regions of the Russian Federation, similar to how Chechnya, Chuvashia, Tatarstan, etc., have their own sort of special status in the formal arrangement of the Russian Federation, which allows them to, I suppose, govern in a very specific way and also adjust their local laws to accommodate for sort of regional differences. Which I suppose the main difference in a region such as Kherson under the leadership of Saldo would be the fact that it is technically adjacent to a foreign hostile enemy. So in fact, it is Kherson is located in a demilitarized zone, which means, I mean, naturally speaking, the implications are quite negative. Like, who would want to invest in a region that's essentially potentially going to be a battlefield in the future if the peace is established? So Kherson essentially is, the future doesn't look bright if some sort of peace treaty is arranged, or even if Kherson turns into some sort of partial demilitarized zone. Who wants to live, invest, build, or even construct a business in a area which will be subject to potential foreign influence in the future? Like, it is kind of a bad prospect. So in fact, he is asking for the Russian Federation to accommodate for this. And in an interview with RIA TV, a big Russian journalist media site, he does say that Kherson is receiving funding from nearby regions and oblasts at the moment, but this funding needs to be streamlined, and so he's looking for ways of potentially consolidating that under his leadership. So perhaps he's looking for more power. My guess is, one, either he wants to actually double dip and get actually control where the funding is going, schools, hospitals, police stations, whatever the infrastructure is required. Maybe he wants to invest in different businesses in the region, not sure. Or two, he actually knows that the region will be strife and ripe with corruption once all this Russian Federation money comes in order to rebuild Kherson, in order to, I suppose, build it up. He's kind of, maybe he's afraid, or maybe he wants to participate in the corruption himself. It's not quite sure. Vladimir Saldo isn't exactly the clearest and the whitest angel. There's not a white dove figure in the Kherson, in this sort of collage of Ukrainian adjacent states, because, mind you, he was pro-Ukrainian until, I believe, even after 2014. So Vladimir Saldo, in fact, has only changed tunes quite recently. It's not like he's been pro-Russian, going back even pre-2014, unlike, some political oppositions of his who we spoke about on some of the 8th Hour episodes in the Kherson region. So very interesting from him. And also the fact that the Novaya Kakhovka Dam was destroyed, and in fact there's essentially a new border being created through the Dnieper River. So the Kherson region is in fact a perfect place for a demilitarized zone, or at least for this buffer area between both Ukraine and the Russian Federation. It's just a matter of how Russia will in fact invest in the Kherson region. Will it build it up, or will it remain abandoned, not just by locals who will probably move to mainland Russian Federation once they receive their visas, citizenships, etc., or will Russia actually invest in the region? I think it's quite an open book. But yeah, as you mentioned, Conrad, I think it's super curious that both the governors of Bryansk and Belgorod, both adjacent to the Kharkov Oblast, are saying that they're looking for Russia to actually enter into Kharkov and take over the whole Kharkov Oblast, because that's the only way that peace can be achieved, to prevent all these various terrorists from crossing the border and harassing the citizens of their particular regions. So in fact, they're pushing the local governors, the local politicians are actually asking the Kremlin to enforce more military action in the Ukraine. They're actually asking for an escalation rather than a diminishing in some sort of peace. In fact, people who want peace are probably sitting in the Kremlin. Meanwhile, the ones who are locally there, who locally see the degeneracy caused by Ukraine, who are actually affected by the conflict on the ground, actually want Ukraine to be punished and want Ukraine to be pushed back. So that seems to be the dichotomy here.
Yeah, I mean, just to see what actually Vladimir Putin said at a meeting with military correspondents, he said, if the shelling of Russian territory continues, Moscow will have to consider creating a sanitary zone in Ukraine so they can't, and I quote, they cannot get us. He's talking about bordering the Bryansk and Belgorod regions. He says the goals and objectives of the special operation changed in accordance with the current situation, but in general, they are of a fundamental nature. Russia is gradually and methodically engaged in the demilitarization of Ukraine. The Ukrainian defense industry will soon completely cease to exist. The Ukrainian counteroffensive is large-scale, using strategic reserves. It began on June 4th. It continues right now. The enemy had no successes in any of the sectors. Now there is an attack of Ukraine in 4 directions. Ukrainian losses and personnel during the counteroffensive are approaching catastrophic. So, obviously they see we've talked about again there being eventually a Russian push, and we saw a few brief pushes, before the fall of Bakhmut in the Zaporozhye direction, just establishing some more footholds. But it seems that from that perspective of demilitarization, if the Russians feel that they've adequately demilitarized Ukraine after, expending them in this latest counteroffensive, we'll definitely see how diplomatic or how militarily they're intent on resolving, this obvious crisis of sanitary zones and incursions and whatnot. But he mentions the goals and objectives of the special operation change in accordance with the current situation. And I think that really relates to, we now have seen obviously nuclear weapons moved into Belarus, and Lukashenko talking about how he thinks the conflict is going to end soon and talking this big diplomatic game. Well, it's understood that, and I believe the guys on Russians with Attitude talk about this a bit, that basically the plan at the beginning of the SMO was for some kind of regime change and a big compromise. But long story short, Lukashenko wasn't capable, after Boris Johnson and the negotiations all fell through, Lukashenko wasn't willing to necessarily immediately engage on a Belarus front, as he didn't feel secure enough in his, I guess, grasp or protection from Poles or from color revolutions. So now it seems that the Russians have diplomatically and strategically secured him in that regard with this move of these nuclear weapons. If you have thoughts on that, Dimitri.
Yeah, I think it's a two-way street. So essentially, it essentially assists Lukashenko in that he knows that there won't be any more color revolutions in Belarus. So it does aid him in that regard, because we do remember the pre-COVID revolts in Belarus were quite severe. In fact, and not just from the side of the actual people revolting, causing and promoting degenerate liberal values. They were strictly and openly anti-orthodox in their outlook. There, in fact, most of them were Uniats, atheists, alphabet community supporters, etc. So they weren't essentially orthodox. But even the police brutality, which some of Lukashenko's police actually had to conduct in order to shut this protest down, was quite severe. So, in fact, the footage was quite real. So the protest was shut down in very severe fashion. And I don't think Lukashenko wants to agitate the Belarusian people anymore, or at least wants them to be agitated. So, in fact, he's happy for this Russian solidarity to come through. And I would also say the closening of Russian-Belarusian relations at the moment also benefit Russia in that they, by planting these military installations on Belarusian soil, also, of course, giving them nuclear missiles, prevents Lukashenko from at any point changing his mind and actually becoming like a semi-quasi-Baltic state, or even changing his mind. Because imagine the incentives. You probably have entire agencies dedicated to working out how to get Belarus to essentially turn into this post-Soviet anti-Russian state. How can we bribe these internal Belarusian ministers who are only getting paid 100,000 USD a year in salary, right? So their salaries are not very high. So how best can you bribe a Belarusian minister, or minister of police, or Belarusian general who's only getting paid maybe 150 grand? You could potentially bribe him with like $5 million American dollars, and that's already 20 years worth of salary for him, if not more, right? So thinking about it, in order to prevent all this bribery, and in order to prevent Belarus from being influenced by Western powers, you can potentially, from the Russian perspective, completely conjoin it with yourself by planting these military installations there. Essentially, what the U.S. has done to Japan in order to prevent any sort of in order to prevent this Belarus from running away and joining any Western influenced powers. Especially if something happens to Lukashenko, you have to think there is a contingency plan if Lukashenko's successors don't follow through with this pro-Russian position. There needs to be something in place for that. So I think it's a very smart move from the Russian Federation. But generally speaking, from an Orthodox Christian perspective, like me and you share, Belarus should be, of course, conjoined to Russia, and they should cooperate, because it is one culture, it is one civilization. So we don't, in fact, oppose these sort of tactical political considerations from Russia and Belarus alike. I think generally there's a very materialistic view of it, and then, of course, there's the spiritual angle, because Belarus is a member of the Russian Orthodox Church in terms of its diocese, the priest there, and in fact it is one country with Russia, culturally speaking, and they should be united. So I think all these things are for the best generally, and hopefully with Ukraine a similar outcome will occur soon. I think what's interesting, I'm not sure if you heard, Conrad, but there was some news regarding Adam Dilimkhanov, leader of the Chechen commanders in Ukraine, apparently getting harmed, similar to how there's rumors about Budanov, the SBU spy chief in Ukraine, actually getting completely taken out and he's being rushed to German hospital. But apparently Ukrainians are claiming he's completely fine. So there's essentially on one side a Russian Chechen commander gets apparently wounded in battle. At least this is news from a few days ago. The Russians are disputing it, but Peskov is saying, so the chief of staff for Russian media for the presidency of Putin, he's saying that, look, we're actually following the news very closely. We're not sure what's happening with Adam Delimhanov. This is the same guy we mentioned on the previous episode who had a bit of a spiff with Prigozhin and Dmitry Utkin, where he just essentially attacked Prigozhin and said, look, you guys need to support Shoigu and the Russian Ministry of Defense. No more complaining, Prigozhin. And Dmitry Utkin called him out. So this is that same guy who we spoke about last week, apparently was wounded. So both sides are having these wounded commanders, and both sides are not exactly confirming whether or not these commanders are alive. So there is a level of, I guess maybe a multiple level of psyop here. There's various layers going on here in the conflicts. But have you heard anything about Budanov, Conrad?
Yeah, I mean, I've heard he's basically done. I've heard Zaluzhny is not dead, but also just no longer capable of participating as the leader of the Ukrainian military. So they're never going to admit this. Obviously, I mean, it's probably for the best, honestly, for them that now there's the entire control apparatus is by shadow figures that aren't known to the people outside, and they can just kind of say that these other guys that are either wounded or dead or whatever are just still somehow in control and are just so focused on work they now just can't talk to the media. But yeah, I mean, that leads us to obviously the idea of, possible what's coming with regime change. But before we say that, I wanted to say as well, the RWA guys had talked about this, that the beginning of the operation was, in many ways, it's pretty clear that the Kazakhstan operation in January of 2022 was, they wanted to do a version of that in Ukraine. But for a various number of reasons, like the arrest and just dissolution of, the Medvedchuk kind of cabal within Ukraine, and then, the Boris Johnson interference and all of that, it just wasn't possible. But when you talk about like Budanov and Zaluzhny and the factionalism within Ukraine and regime change, I think we're really starting to see some of the narrative off-ramps, I guess you could say, from the mainstream media in the West about putting some blame on the actual Ukrainians themselves to tone down Western support. We're seeing it's in the Wall Street Journal, it's in the New York Times, that apparently the Ukrainians themselves blew up the Nord Stream pipelines, and the United States, had been warning the Ukrainians not to touch the Nord Stream pipelines, but they did it anyway, which, that seems like a pretty convenient thing for the U.S. to say now that the Ukrainians are losing their counteroffensive, and everyone knows that the U.S. blew up the Nord Stream pipelines.
Yeah, I think there's no question that the United States and the powers that be, the globalists, the EU, NATO, they're all looking at they have many options on the table, so it's essentially a multiple choice. At the moment, the priority is clearly to defend Ukraine, to train it up, but there is also a scapegoat or an exit plan, right? So the exit plan, whether or not it'll be executed, whether or not Zelensky will literally physically be executed as Ukraine leaves the conflict, or half of it goes towards Russia, or there's some sort of demilitarization, denazification takes place, which makes sense, because think of all these Azov battalion people or mercenaries coming from the United States and all these typically, how do we even describe it, Aryan countries which are joining and fighting for this member of the cabal Zelensky, right, and Kolomoisky, etc. These people, these mercenaries, they will be discarded like trash at the end of the day, right? So when a peace is established, when the West actually surrenders, all these people who are I suppose have been fooled into supporting these neo-Nazi battalions who've joined out of complete pathos and passion and emotion, essentially saying that, well, Ukraine needs to be supported because of the white race, because it's Russia's this evil thing, and like we're gonna build a white state in Ukraine. All these delusional people are going to be abandoned by the powers that be in the end, which I think this has been coming for a long time now. So in fact, I don't necessarily feel sorry for them. It's like the Azov battalion, all of these various battalions, Aidar even, for example, like they've all clearly stated they support Zelensky. They're even partially Zionist, but they don't understand that at the end of the day, they're the ones who are going to be left to face Russian trials, Russian long sentences under, in Russian prison, and Putin's recent crackdown on extremism, you can say, anti-Islamic rhetoric in Russia as well, kind of points to that as well. So Russia's really clamping down on any sort of extremist rhetoric, even from its own citizens. How do they think they'll cope under Russian rule, which the West will abandon them to? And frankly, the West, like we all know, the West uses the West uses right-wing organizations all the time in order to, solicit support for its own regime. Like, there's federal agents essentially in all these organizations, and the ones in Ukraine are no different. In fact, they're probably much easier to control when you send over funding, and just it's probably directly funded by money as opposed to ideology. Maybe even a lot easier to infiltrate, as we've seen.
Well, I think as well you have to realize it's part of why, look, I think everyone's getting a little sick of this perpetual, like, obviously it's bizarre that the West, suddenly just is okay with iron crosses and swastikas, but look, as far as the current situation and as far as the people that are actually around the world supporting Russia and the Russian Federation and the people of the Donbass, the whole like Nazi versus, fascist thing isn't exactly the most powerful device, but the reason they keep that open all the time is that they know, look, Ukraine went from being, what you could say at least a plurality state that had a, pro-Russian bent within, a few years, a decade or so, completely like a new nation was born, like complete ethnogenesis, like there was a total, you know, this complete propping up of Ukrainian identity. But because of that can, it's not as deep as something else, right? That can be shifted. And if the Ukrainian people are truly become fatigued with what's going on and finally start to realize the West and Zelensky are just as much, if not more, to blame than the Russians, I could see a lot of those people kind of, there might be some cognitive dissonance involved, but almost shifting pretty quickly and being, you know what, no, it was these EU fascists, these they've propped up these Nazis, and we have to return to like normalcy, and they might never be pro-Russian, but they'll just be like above it all, and they'll call out that the other side too. And so the Russians are always keeping that narrative door open because they know they have to do that if they're actually going to successfully occupy the territories they have now, let alone, everything everything east of the Dnieper.
I mean, of course, we're not going to say that Russia won't take very harsh measures if it, say, does in the end win in the Ukrainian war and it has to sort of administer these in the entirety of Ukraine, the territory. We all know what happened when Stalin essentially won World War II and took over the regions of, took back Sevastopol, took back Crimea. All the Crimean Tatars, the majority of which sided with Nazi Germany, surprisingly, a lot of them were deported and forcefully transported, which is why when people speak about the deportation of the Crimean Tatars, they're missing the fact that almost 3/4 of them sided with the Third Reich as soon as Barbarossa began. So, in fact, and a lot of the crimes against the local Russian citizens of Sevastopol, of Crimea, of the inner regions, at least a lot of the Soviet villages, Russian villages, essentially white native Russians who moved into Crimea during the 1800s. These Crimean Tatars, essentially, at least those radicals and extremists amongst their ranks, began massacring a lot of them. There was rape, pillage, villages were burnt. And the Soviet Union, even during Brezhnev's years, there was a vote passed. Brezhnev was essentially bringing in all these repressed elements from the Soviet society, taking people out of prisons, essentially claiming that, well, Stalin went a bit too far. There was even a vote in the Soviet Union: should we rehabilitate the Crimean Tatars? And I believe the majority voted against it because the Crimean Tatars essentially mostly sided with Nazi Germany. So, in fact, you may see similar sort of anti-neo-Nazi, anti-Banderite, I think would be more accurate, anti-Bandera actions from Russia in Ukraine, especially. It'll obviously take a more legal form than what Stalin and the Soviet government was using against the Crimean Tatars, essentially through executive action, just shipping them out of Crimea and essentially dispersing them along the Soviet Union, sending a lot of them to gulags, etc. It's pretty harsh, but what we're going to see in Ukraine will probably will be very similar to that. I think what's also interesting is just the fact that this Bandera ideology, it's not even the classical neo-Nazi Aryanism we saw during the Second World War. In fact, it's taking its own blasphemous, sacrilegious colors. In fact, we saw the Upper Kiev Caves Cathedral in Kiev, of course, captured by the schismatic church created by Zelensky and his ilk Poroshenko. They for the first time in 300 years, they served a moleben, which is a prayer for a deceased person. They served a liturgical service for Mazepa, and Hetman Mazepa was essentially one of the leaders who rose up, sided with the Polish, sided with the Swedish against the young Russian Empire, against Peter the Great, and he broke at least 2 oaths which he swore on the cross. So he kissed the gospel. He was a Russian leader in the Russian military, a general, you can say. He was the right-hand man of Peter the Great, and Peter the Great had everybody swear these oaths to protect Russia and the integrity of the Russian Tsardom, and he kissed the gospel, he kissed the cross, he promised that he won't ever betray Peter nor the Russian Orthodox Church, and he'll always defend Russian Orthodox people. And then he sided with the Swedish and the Polish, and essentially forced, almost started this Ukrainian uprising in the 1700s. And now the Ukrainian church is praying for him. This man was anathematized, essentially disconnected from the church. He's a cursed figure in Russian history from the early 1700s. He is one of the dark marks on Russian history. In fact, he's considered to be the progenitor of the Ukrainian ethnos. They see him as a national hero, but in fact, this person is, to this day, some churches in Russia actually mention him in the list of anathema during the triumph of orthodoxy. He's like Leo Tolstoy, one of these, and Vladimir Lenin, one of these like cursed people who are definitely in hell. Like they're proclaimed to be disconnected from the church, and now Ukrainians are praying for him. But their ideology, in fact, is so destructive that they're bringing up these images of these cursed figures from history in order to. I mean, I feel sorry for anybody actually attending these services and praying for them in a holy place like Kiev Petroslava or any church in the Ukraine. It's incredibly blasphemous, and the conclusions are probably quite dire for Ukraine if they continue these sort of actions on a cultural level. Keeps promoting them. It's pretty low.
It is, and like you said, there has seemed to be a slight downturn in the overt persecutions in the church. I mean, we bring that up a little bit when we talk about what's going on in Cyprus with the recognition of the schismatics there, but we've been talking about that for a while. Unless you have anything else to say about Russia, Ukraine, there's still a lot of stuff going on in Serbia, Kosovo, as well as what seems to even be raids on villages actually within Serbia itself, like mainland, like recognized Serbia proper, by Muslim extremists raiding even certain Serbian villages and vandalizing churches and whatnot, which, I mean, this just kind of goes to show that some of this Kosovar Albanian nationalism and stuff has really gotten out of control. Like, it's why someone like Albin Kurti, the head of Kosovo, is felt emboldened to completely reject like the notion of Serb municipalities to the point where his government is now sanctioned by the United States.
Yeah, that's right. It doesn't seem like diversity is really working out for the former Yugoslavia, at least from the Islamic Orthodox cooperation angle. At least we don't see it really in the Albanian, Serbian, Serbian adjacent areas, especially Kosovo. It does seem like whatever, and you could say the foreign powers are causing this is unipolarity, but I think it really does show that if there are two groups in there and constant opposition, in fact, unless you have one strong force which overridingly controls the whole state, for example, like in Russia, you have an Orthodox Christian majority, which keeps the members of the Russian Federation who are Muslim, as well as Jewish, Buddhist, etc., all these various minority groups, including various schismatics, all believers. It keeps them in line. In fact, in the Albanian-Serbian conflict in Kosovo, after all the Albanians were moved in, this, in fact, was shifted, and now I believe it's almost an equivalent amount of people on either side, and this tension, it's not really resolvable, I guess, on a local political level, which the Kosovo situation has shown. So the fact that we're seeing more crimes on a locally in that region really doesn't surprise me. I think it really speaks ill of NATO, the fact that they continue to support this agitation against the Orthodox Christian people there. On the positive end, I suppose there have been no negative news about the Serbians being abused in Bosnia. So the Republika Srpska on the Bosnian end, in fact, is perhaps the most peaceful area, or at least the Serbs there are in fact enjoying themselves, as opposed to those Serbs involved in any Albanian Kosovo related matters. It's not looking too good. In fact, the entire former Yugoslavian region, that Upper Balkans region, is in fact, I think, a fire pit. It's already ripe for some sort of foreign intervention, or this something bad's probably definitely going to happen, especially with a shaky Serbian political situation with the president mentioning his resignation, right? I think there may be some negative outcomes to that.
Well, and in Kosovo, they've supposedly banned, Serbian license plates, which there's people that live in quote unquote Kosovo that have Serbian license plates, as we've discussed that whole ordeal on past episodes, and it got resolved where the people were allowed to keep their license plates. So the Kosovars are, as usual, stepping things up, and it just seems that, I don't know, they feel emboldened by, I guess, the actual Albanians themselves to do this, because like you said, the US has completely condemned what Kurti is doing. The EU has issued sanctions packages. I mean, Serbia has, according to Kosovo, kidnapped 3 police officers, whereas Serbia claims the police officers were traipsing around in Serbia with military gear and were then arrested, which I've seen the video. Only one side has presented video so far, and it was the Serbs. So I think I'm going to go ahead and side with what I've seen there. I wasn't seeing it as, it wasn't in Kosovo. There was a whole lot of Serbian activity going on. But it does seem that the the Kosovo Albanians have pushed it a little bit too far, and I think even Albania, like the authorities of Albania itself, weren't even happy with what they were doing.
Maybe this is a positive angle. Perhaps this conflict, I mean, as bloody and as awkward as it may be, these the various skirmishes between shopkeepers, police officers, rebels on both sides, rebels in terms of people who don't listen to the law, obviously local. Kosovo law is not perfect anyway, so the people who break the law, and on either side of the conflict, perhaps maybe this slowing down Serbia's ascension into the EU and perhaps even into NATO itself, right? We don't know what exactly the end goals are of the Serbian bureaucracy, the political bureaucracy ruling the country. Clearly, the Orthodox population doesn't want any sort of alphabetization of the Serbian nation, but nevertheless, the politicians are the ones moving the actual handles of the clock here. So it's just a matter of maybe this is somewhat providential. The fact that this conflict is still ongoing and it prevents Serbia from entering into this liberal paradigm, this liberal world order. So, in fact, maybe it's slowing down enough for some sort of break when multipolarity does finally begin. When the U.S., I guess, economically partially collapses and Serbia is kind of free to act on its in this territory. Perhaps maybe the delay just needs to happen until then, or maybe until Russia wins in Ukraine, then Russia can somewhat assist the Serbian people. But at the moment, they kind of have their hands tied. I'm not too sure. There's various, of course, speculations on this issue. So, but it does seem like Serbia's ascension to the EU, I think, will be a major turning point. Because look, at the moment, the Kosovo and Serbia are both appealing to Brussels in order to resolve the conflict. So they're already treating each other as these fellow members of the United European Union. So it's quite negative. No one's appealing to Russia to resolve the issue. They're appealing to Brussels and Belgium, which is even further away.
Now, and you mentioned the Bosnia, Republika Srpska, and everything, and further and further. I mean, Dodik has issued a new law to stop OHR, which is the like high authority of Bosnia, which is kind of the EU NATO representative. That kind of it's kind of like how I don't know. I grew up in a former, in the British overseas territory where there's the local government that does all their stuff. Like Bosnia has like a prime minister and they've got all that stuff. But then there's like there's a white man that comes in from that's how it works, and that comes in and is still like the real representative of what the real powers that be, and reports back to the cabal back in Brussels or the UK. And Dodik has said that they no longer need those decisions shouldn't be proliferated around Srpska, and effectively I guess aren't going to be enforced. So he's really just moving towards both not recognizing the Muslim government in Sarajevo, as well as the NATO EU authority that also is like is parenting that meme country, attempting to bring it into adulthood.
And just kind of on a side issue, I did notice a very funny image. So reading news about the Ukrainian spy chief Budanov is essentially you notice the actual portrait he has in the background of his office. It's essentially an owl sitting on a sword, and the sword is piercing Russia. Now you see this image in 1980 Soviet cartoons where you have the cartoon Ivan Tsarevich and Kashay Besmertny, which essentially is a cartoon about Ivan the Prince and how he goes on to slay this immortal undead warlock named Koshchei the Immortal. And essentially, in Koshchei the Immortal's castle, there's this owl which sits on a sword as well. It's a very Bohemian Grove type imagery. We see this with, of course, Drake's albums as well, where there's an owl. It's a very Illuminati-esque symbology. So I'm very interested, just kind of on an esoteric note, why the Ukrainians, why their federal agency, the spy agency, essentially the equivalent of their KGB, which used to persecute Orthodox Christians, the NKVD, this progenitor, why it's using this owl symbol, at least sitting on a sword, is essentially equivalent to what was shown in the Soviet cartoons, based on these old ancient Russian fairy tales about immortal undead warlocks, etc. So very esoteric and interesting, just something I noticed in the Budanov story. So again, Ukraine, very dark place at the moment, ruled by very dark and evil people. So it's not really surprising that they use these Bohemian images.
There's Masonic imagery all over some of these certain places. Places like Astana, in Kazakhstan, places. I believe in Kosovo, with all the NATO EU, there's been a lot of Masonic symbolism spotted as well. But yeah, obviously we're watching Serbia Kosovo almost as it's kind of the little the cold or little brother of the Ukraine conflict in many ways. We're going to be watching it closely, but as far as the rest of the world goes, we're seeing France want to join BRICS, which is, we've seen a few moves in the past of Macron wanting to, he's kind of realized that America doesn't have the EU and Europe's best interest at heart, and he says, he wants to have a French-led, technocratic, liberal, liberal fascist EU that, is diverse and whatnot, that is against America and stands on its own, and I guess has relations with China. And the Global Times wrote, and China has hinted that they said that France joining BRICS would be bold and innovative. And they were asking the head of South Africa for an invitation to the summit, but it seems that Russia has no interest in allowing that to happen. And that would obviously be because France is very actively funding the war effort in Ukraine and directly killing Russian civilians. But it's an interesting move, of course. It's clear that Macron no longer cares at all. He feels that he has a strong enough grip over France that he can just very openly signal against the U.S., the U.K. Out of the U.K. is left. It's kind of and Germany's now in an official recession and the Nord Stream pipeline destroyed. He's kind of preparing for this battle between France and Italy for control of the European Union. And while France is ultimately a more powerful and relevant economic bloc than Italy, it seems that Maloney has a lot more actual political capital in the rest of the EU, surprisingly enough, with right-wing government in Sweden, right-wing government in Hungary, right-wing governments rising in places like Spain, even, the European coalition in Germany is still even becoming, more reactionary just based on the horrible governance of the Greens. So in general, it seems that Maloney is actually poised to win, and Maloney hasn't been. Sure, if I was in Italy, I'd rather have her. She's deporting illegals, she's stopping the migrant crisis, she's against sodomy and the pride stuff, but she's just as gung ho about supporting Ukraine as Macron is. So it'll be an interesting power struggle to watch, and it seems actually. Maybe what if Maloney ends up siding more with the Americans and they end up supporting someone more quote unquote right wing because they see Macron as actually more of an independent player. It shows you politics is a bit deeper than than just the political spectrum on things. But I don't know, maybe Le Pen wins in France somehow, or a right wing person, and then France joins BRICS, and we really see. And look, I'll say this: like years ago, I made a map, like about if World War III breaks out and every country literally is forced to pick a side. I had France possibly, as one of the first European countries to, side against NATO or leave NATO or, lead to the dissolution of NATO. So it's not. I don't think it's impossible. France has always the right in France, especially, has always been more Russophilic than others.
France definitely has a bit of a Russophilic flavor, even going back to the reign of Alexander III, who actually formally solidified a peace between France and Russia. That's notwithstanding the Crimean War, even the Napoleonic Wars. So the 19th century is actually very interesting. In fact, of course, Russia borrowed money for investments from France as well in order to boost its economic growth in the early 20th century as well during Tsar Nicholas II's reign. And France, of course, supported Russia in World War I against the Prussian rising, Wilhelm's Prussian Germany, essentially. So there is this idea, at least, that potentially France and Russia could have this strategic alliance. This is despite the fact that France, I guess, at its inception, ontologically, it is a liberal, Masonic, Republican country. But even Charles de Gaulle wasn't necessarily anti-Russian in his policies. In fact, he was kind of positioning France as a certain state which is a bit on the side, not really under the influence of America. In fact, an independent proper nuclear power, which holds seat on the Security Council of the UN. So France is like I wouldn't call it the sick man of Europe, but it's definitely like an auxiliary country in Europe, in order that it's never central, it's never primal, but it's never like the primal sort of country. When you think about the European Union, you always think about Germany first, France second. So France would always, and even I think it would prefer to even see itself on the side. And Macron today, in a sort of de Gaullean politics, he is, I think, betting on multiple horses here. So he's essentially almost like at a casino, and he's playing blackjack and Texas Hold'em and poker on the side, betting on various tables. So he's like, oh, please, could you guys invite me to the BRICS summit? At the same time, he's going to Armenia, trying to juggle that piece. He's sending Erdogan congratulations. He's at the same time supporting Zelensky and Ukraine as well, visiting Kiev. So he's doing various things here. He's playing on various fronts, and of course his relationship with Xi Jinping, he's trying to, of course, improve it, and saying that France and China should have a strategic partnership, and moving forward they should be strong economic allies. It's just a bizarre mix right, of takes, and Macron's definitely looking out for France in terms of at least he's a weird guy himself, but I'm thinking perhaps he does have some good faith consideration for the future of the French people in terms of their autonomy and how they can view themselves in this future multipolar world. So France should not die for Europe. When the EU falls apart, France should actually have, I think, preferably for the French people, its own independent state with its own nuclear-powered economy, nuclear-powered infrastructure, and that it can actually go forward in this multipolar world and actually have a say on things and not be relegated to the sidelines. I think that's what he's hedging on here. But again, it's also a matter of who wins in the end. Will it be the NATO unipolar world hegemony? Will they keep increasing the debt ceiling? Will Russia be completely debilitated, destroyed, and enter into a civil war after they lose in Ukraine? Or will this new multipolar reality emerge in which France will need to take part in as a sort of independent actor, which I think he's hedging on both scenarios playing out. Either way, France benefits according to Macron's policies here.
Well, and it's also, I mean, they're also going to have to deal with the fact that they also have Muslims, stabbing children on a playground, in their cities and whatnot, which is going to be, that's the problem. Maybe if maybe a French version of Maloney would, do all the kicking out of all the Muslims, but also not be a NATO, Ukraine shill. That's kind of what we're hoping for that will eventually exist, which we have Viktor Orban, but, Hungary is a whole lot less relevant than France, Italy, Germany, even Spain. So we're going to obviously, France, maybe if Macron quickly decides to change, is the first one to turn his back on Zelensky, maybe then Russia will let him into BRICS. Maybe give him a pass. But BRICS is. It seems that South Africa, they're doing all sorts of diplomacy. They're really kind of flexing their muscles, that they seem to realize that BRICS is becoming this kind of international institution. But we've seen NATO trying to flex itself, and Japan, France is also kind of signaling again towards the BRICS direction. Stoltenberg, NATO wanted to start a Japan, kind of field office for NATO, for kind of really shifting NATO's focus to the Pacific and China, and France vetoed that. So France is very much, that was definitely Macron signaling towards, his wannabe new buddy Xi Jinping, that yeah, man, see, I'm about this BRICS thing, I'm about this multipolarity thing. I'm not with them boys, man. Like, I'm one of you guys. So, we'll see how China maybe seems more convinced right now than Russia, but, we'll see what the rest of the people say, and if it's brought up at, the summit's coming up.
Yeah, that's right. Summit's coming up, and, hopefully Macron does get invited. In fact, this could all be a big play for popularity. I have heard certain Russian commentators and journalists claim that all Macron wants is to be at the center of things in order to support any sort of re-election or future in his political game. So him actually asking to be on the BRICS committee is not actually a pro-France state. It's just a personal political aspiration to be on the covers of newspapers. He's always primarily interested in, being on the front cover, being in front. He's not very subtle about it. Very selfish, in fact. So could be that. But there's other considerations, I think, around the world, given the recent veto for the NATO office in Japan. So pretty outstanding news, I think, given the fact that Japan already has several. I mean, not several. It has probably the largest amount of military bases of the United States in the Pacific Ocean. Despite, not mentioning American territories such as Hawaii, but Japan definitely is the most American-dominated state in Asia, I would say. Probably second only to Taiwan, if that.
Oh, like I just said, that was France's veto of that office was obviously, they're showing China, not obviously they're trying to show China that they're not all in on the NATO thing. Just because they're supporting Ukraine in the war there doesn't mean that they're not on board maybe with this multipolarity stuff. So it's going to be really interesting to watch and to see if, because NATO has said, like, they published the whole thing, Russia's our number one threat, and China is, we're watching China rise. The U.S. State Department said China's our number one threat, and we're, assisting our NATO allies and, our allies in Ukraine against Russia. So, the U.S. State Department and the NATO doctrine kind of go hand in hand there. But we are definitely seeing, certain levels of NATO fatigue, France being one of the earliest ones to kind of fall off there. And we're having to see, it's not just the new office in Japan, it's the fact that, some of these countries are running out of ammunition to send to Ukraine, so are having to recruit Japan, South Korea, these other places that obviously aren't in NATO to send Ukraine more ammunition because they're running out. There's talks of Ukraine buying like 30 Israeli tanks or something like that, which, who knows if Israel wants to really go all the way down that road, we'll keep track on that. But it seems that, the packages are getting smaller and smaller from U.S. and obviously they say they're going to stay with Ukraine to the end, but we've seen the narrative off ramps, so we're going to have to see how long that lasts. But unless you have anything else to say, kind of about the BRICS, world, I want to talk about what's going on in Cyprus.
I think the situation, honestly, happening in Cyprus now is very peculiar, at least on the ecclesiological front. And again, could it be agitated by Erdogan's sudden, surprise visit, at least to northern Cyprus, after he visited Azerbaijan, Baku, with his new cabinet members, essentially, proclaiming that Turkey will still support all of Azerbaijan's policies, including their foreign political aspirations, and kind of solidifying that Turkic trust, as well as, visiting northern Cyprus to kind of agree that, look, the Turkish people still stand on the position that northern Cyprus is Turkish. In fact, I think I think the majority of them, at least the nationalists within Turkey, do claim all of Cyprus as Turkish territory. Of course, the southern side is, according to them, still occupied by Greece. So, in fact, despite all the ecclesiological issues, there is also the political angle, I think, which raises some eyebrows. So Erdogan essentially, again, kind of doing something which could agitate at least the Greek residents of the Mediterranean. So I think this definitely will have some effect long term. We all recall a few years ago, 3 years ago, in 2020, when the Mosque of Hagia Sophia the Museum of Hagia Sophia, the former cathedral, was transformed into a mosque again by Erdogan's commission. And now, of course, there are Muslim prayers conducted within its walls. This was, of course, an unprecedented act and, a commitment by Erdogan to this new image of Turkey as, increasing its Islamic clout in the world, sort of its comeback as this potential future caliphate for the Muslims, this center of power, as opposed to the countries in the Hejaz. I think that's the long-term prospect. But Cyprus, yeah, it's looking quite tumultuous. There's definitely a certain split there, spiritually speaking, right?
Well, and it's a good thing you bring up the whole Erdogan angle because, we talked with David about how and he's like, yeah, the Cyprus issue, no one's going to talk about that because, both sides are trying to play up their nationalist credentials because that was kind of where the lines were drawn with, Sinan Oğan and, which, obviously political Islam has certain nationalist appeal to some, and obviously extreme and being anti-political Islam has a lot of nationalist appeal to others and really hardcore Kemalists. So, obviously, but Sinan Oğan ended up endorsing Erdogan in the end as the nationalist. So it shows you where that it really went both ways. And but despite that, though, the whole Northern Cyprus issue is so contentious on the geopolitical stage that neither candidate, wanted to rock the boat with, just the other geopolitical entities that are involved there, the British, the U.S., NATO, the Greeks. That wasn't an issue that they were going to bring up. But what happens right after the election, right after he's politically secure, he visits Northern Cyprus saying, "Yep, I'm reaching to I'm visiting the outer regions of the empire and saying that, maybe we will go further." And obviously you're right that would cause some turmoil in Cyprus, especially among the bishops. We know Metropolitan Neophytos has spoken explicitly about the fallout that will happen once certain political events occur in Turkey that we've seen were, narrowly averted and pushed back perhaps by a few years by this Erdogan victory. And part of that, of course, involves actually a retreat from northern Cyprus by the troops there due to, conflict with Russians and Ukraine and other things like that. So it's obviously interesting to see, but, when it comes to Cyprus, the ecclesial split obviously involves recognition of the OCU schismatics with, the new Archbishop Georgios, whose election we covered very closely on the show. He was a big supporter of the schismatics, as well as some of the other powerful bishops have been switched, like Metropolitan Isaiah of Tomasos. We have a few others, but Metropolitan Neophytos we know has stood strong, as well as Metropolitan Nikiforos of Kikos. And he has stood strong, but has still expressed a desire to, he will concelebrate with the Archbishop, and he will still do that despite openly, recognizing Onufri as the head. He's very concerned about church unity in Cyprus, whereas Metropolitan Neophytos, he he stayed at home and prayed for the persecuted church in Ukraine as opposed to attending the enthronement of Archbishop Georgios. But what's even more interesting, and I think, forgive me for taking any kind of pleasure in division in the church, it just is, I would say pretty baller what this metropolitan did. Of course, Metropolitan Georgios was the Metropolitan of Paphos before he then became Archbishop Georgios of, the equivalent of the Patriarch of the Church of Cyprus. And of course, very quickly after he was elected, one of the first things he did was they consecrated a new bishop of Paphos. And they, of course, elected Metropolitan Tychikos. He is a younger bishop than some of these other guys, and he was actually the spiritual child of Archbishop Georgios. And he has since explicitly refused to support the Ukrainian schismatics to the point where he has now refused to celebrate with Archbishop Georgios because he knows the Ukrainian schismatics will be commemorated. And I just find it interesting after doing this, Archbishop Georgios, this is from Ortho Christian, characterized the Metropolitan of Paphos stance as, quote, childish. Epiphany of Kiev was commemorated on the day that Metropolitan Tychikos was consecrated as a bishop, so how can he reject Epiphany now? The Archbishop wonders. Which, it just shows you. I think he was playing it close to the chest. He was obedient to his spiritual father, but once, he was granted the power to bind and loose as a bishop, by the church, he decided now was the time, he had waited enough, was the time to stand by his principles and stand by the canons. So I think it's just a very interesting development. It shows you that no matter how, quote unquote, institutionalized you might think of a certain church figure as, the Holy Spirit can always, speak the truth, and, schism can always be rejected.
Yeah, and I think ultimately, again, this entire schism is a huge, painful wound on Russian-Greek relations, because you have to remember the Russian Orthodox Church prevents any of its laity as well as clergy from essentially co-celebrating and participating in the mysteries and divine rites of the Greek churches. So essentially, Cyprus is included there. Russia cannot invite, say, Neophytos or Morpho to Ukraine to serve in any of the liturgical rites. It's simply that would just go against its regulation. Metropolitan Onufri can't do the same. In fact, and I don't even think Metropolitan Neophytos could do this. So it's essentially incredibly painful. This entire schism has perpetuated this brief rift in Russian-Greek relations. But of course, historically, as we know, schisms have lasted for a lot longer. Some schisms have lasted for decades and were resolved, fairly amicably in the end. So the church does have these internal mechanisms of resolving the schism. So at least those of you listening who may be at least negatively affected by this or feel like this thing will last forever. It has been 5 years, but in fact, the churches are working on them. Obviously, the fact that the schism has lasted so long, and there seems to be this bizarre stubbornness from these pro-Western, pro-Ukrainian hierarchs, it's definitely due to Western influence. So it's definitely Western influence. There's no logic to it. There's no theological backing. It's not a theologumenon of any sort. It's all artificially, politically inspired. And we're not talking about church-inspired politics. These are raw, secular considerations here. It's essentially they're using these Greek jurisdictions as geopolitical weapons against united, essentially, the entire Orthodox world community generally, not just Russia, because again, working on this schism for many years on their end, of course, the Council of Crete, etc., all these ecumenical considerations, and on top of that, now they have this Ukrainian ace up their sleeve. It's generally speaking quite a negative thing. So of course, these hierarchs actually independently making decisions for themselves, not co-celebrating, not joining heretics and schismatics, because again, if you have to remember, the church canons actually equivalate in terms of in terms of worship, and where schismatics and heretics fall, they are on the same page. So schismatics and heretics, the church views them in exactly the same way. And in fact, they are somewhat synonymous too. So there isn't really like you kind of claim, oh, well, I'm not going to co-celebrate with heretics, but I'll co-celebrate with schismatics. No, it's one and the same, essentially, in the eyes of the church. So co-celebrating with Epiphany or any of his clergymen who come over to Cyprus for a Mediterranean holiday like Zaluzhny, right? That's not a good idea. They shouldn't, you shouldn't co-celebrate with them. So again, kudos to the righteous hierarchs of Cyprus. I think that's a great thing.
Well, and I guess we also recently saw Patriarch Bartholomew appear with Dumenko and say, the OCU will always be, the Church of Ukraine. Anyone who rejects their autocephaly, is against Orthodoxy, all this stuff. And I'm just wondering if that has anything also to do with, last week we also covered the terrible thing in public Orthodoxy from those clowns that, was just slandering the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and being pro the schismatics and saying that, narratives about their persecution aren't true. And, of course, we have seen a slight decline in the persecution. I'm wondering if, Bartholomew, some of the State Department lackeys and these characters were like, hey, you guys, maybe pump the brakes on this. You're giving these people too much legitimacy. The blood, there's too much blood of the waters that's watering the church too much. Like, you need to, like, because that was true. Like, there was, like, you couldn't see anything about the church without seeing enough people just ratioing it on Twitter, or people just like, no one in the Orthodox Church that I'm aware of is like an explicit supporter of the OCU. Even the people that may be more pro-Ukrainian, they just think the whole situation is sad.
Yeah, that's right. It's essentially very negative, and it does play into other jurisdictional issues, such as the Russian Church is actually expanding in Africa faster than the Greek Orthodox Church of Alexandria is. So you have to consider that the Russian Orthodox are now evangelizing Africa, essentially at the same speed as what the Greek hierarchs were doing, minus the various weird racisms which were taking place. And nothing against the righteous hierarchs of the Alexandrian Church, but a lot of them did side with their synod when they began supporting Epiphany. And I believe mostly it had to do with the Patriarch of Alexandria's personal stance. So Patriarch Theodoros was, or at least became, very good friends with Epiphany. There's photographs of them together, basically hanging out. I'm sure they agree. It's not just that he's being blackmailed or he's siding with the ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew. It's simply that Patriarch Theodoros, I believe, actually believes that Epiphany has some sort of blessing from God in order to rule the metropolia of Kiev. So it is very bizarre in that case. So yeah, the issues of Cyprus, Russia still hasn't, like, Russia does not have an exarchate in Cyprus. So in fact, Cypriots have less reason to be upset at Russia than, say, the Greeks of Africa and Alexandria. So I think that too, Russians haven't, in fact, agitated Cyprus much. But you do hear online sometimes, whenever Russia makes a positive move towards Turkey, you do see a lot of uprising and claims that how can Russia support Turkey when Turkey turned the Hagia Sophia museum into a mosque? Well, look, what's more offensive, Hagia Sophia being a museum or a mosque? In my eyes, Conrad, I feel like they're both quite offensive. I feel like the church of, if it's a church of God, if it's consecrated, which it isn't, the Hagia Sophia consecration was essentially lifted. The church was, not only was massive blood spilt in the church, people were raped in the church in 1453. So the church is not, the Hagia Sophia Cathedral, many must realize it needs to be reconsecrated. It needs what you would call a great consecration service. You cannot conduct the Holy Spirit, even in that vision that occurred during the siege of Constantinople, the Holy Spirit and the grace that God has abandoned the Hagia Sophia. So in fact, Hagia Sophia needs to be blessed again before we can even call it a mosque, or call one or the other worse. It is in the worst state possible. It has been since 1453. The church is not. I mean, dogs were allowed into it. Muslims greatly disrespected that place from the beginning. So the fact that Erdogan has made it into a mosque doesn't, in fact, somehow add another mark against the Orthodox Church. No, the place has been disrespected for over 600 years now. We just have to get over it. Once God grants it back to us, the Orthodox people, then we can, of course, clean it up and bless it again. But for now, our politics shouldn't be determined by this great, I think, artwork of Orthodox history. I think geopolitics and sort of real considerations based in the Orthodox faith come first, and we have to keep this in mind. There shouldn't be any wars over this particular cathedral, I think. Even the Russian Empire never considered, of course, attacking Turkey just over the fact that, over this one cathedral. The considerations were much grander than that.
Well, what's worse, a convoluted geopolitical relationship that doesn't, in your mind, adequately consider this one thing, or, celebrating and recognizing schismatics, like kind of, bored in your eye of your neighbor kind of thing. But obviously, within GoArch, we also, of course, saw another episode of Elpidophoros at St. Bartholomew's, Episcopal Church in New York, with gay flags and everything like that on, the feast day of St. Bartholomew, with the blessing of Patriarch Bartholomew. So, well, we were a bit white-pilled on Patriarch Bartholomew last week with him smacking down Elpidophoros and, rejecting his reworking and takeover of the GoArch Synod, and seemingly apologizing to the GoArch Synod and the faithful for his actions. Well, it seems that only extended so far and had nothing to do with the substance of what Elpidophoros is about, and modernity, and, all that jazz. So, the Green Patriarch, as he's called, we're we're awaiting 2025 with dread as, as things go on, some of us fear the worst, if, some people know what I mean there.
Yeah, I think it's almost as if, at least in the Greek Orthodox community of America, the alphabet community itself has a larger stakeholders than, say, even Greek monarchists or Greek conservatives or people who, even Greek nationalists of some sort. It seems like whenever Elpidophoros makes these sort of concessions, the alphabet community just takes more, and it just creates a bad image for the church, generally speaking, because one of the strengths of the Orthodox Church is that it stands very strong in its dogmas and traditions, and it doesn't concede to all these worldly degeneracies. So Elpidophoros does, I mean, even though mind you, he only controls a very small part of the Orthodox Church in the world, probably less than 1% of the overall demographic population, and he's simply one archbishop, right? When there's, hundreds more archbishops other than him in the entire world. But the fact that he's well spoken in English, and he appears on these English media shows and makes appearances and votes for Biden, all these degenerate things, marches of BLM. This only of course paints the Orthodox Church in a bad light in America. So generally speaking, it not only is it bad for him personally appearing as a supporter of the alphabet community alongside, in this I'm not even sure, this heretical structure, right? Co-celebrating things like that, but it also affects Orthodox people in America very badly. Because, again, the mainstream media paints all of Orthodox either as very separate, disparate members of these ethnic communities, the Antiochians, the Arabs, the Greeks, Americans, Russians, as very separate, or they all paint us under the same brush as, oh, we're all related and this guy is your leader. No, he isn't, in fact. Say Conrad, for example, belongs to the Antiochian church. Elpidophoros has no say on what Conrad's church jurisdiction does. Like, he can't commit the same sins within its borders. So yeah, of course the mainstream media disingenuously either paints Orthodoxy in America as very, very kind of weird, these ethnic broken off communities, or they paint it with one brush, like the entire church supports the alphabet community based on what Elpidophoros does. The entire church supports BLM. It definitely does not. And I think the evidence is quite clear when you check the overall view of the hierarchs in the United States. Generally, it's still the conservative views still win out.
And you're right. Elpidophoros presides over, maybe 500,000 Orthodox Christians at best. Maybe if you count what's going on in Canada, maybe 600,000, something like that. But again, he's the head of a synod which has maintained its power as having multiple metropolias. Those metropolitans have real power. And again, he's also only relevant because he's considered a possible likely successor to Patriarch Bartholomew, which seems more and more unlikely as, he gets smacked down in his ambitions, and, he has apologies issued on his behalf, and that's not necessarily a good thing. There's people like Emmanuel of Chalcedon who could be like even exponentially worse somehow than Bartholomew and even Elpidophoros. So, keep all of that in your prayers, but it's important that, yeah, we recognize, you're right, exactly. Me and Dimitri have Elpidophoros has no power over us, you know what I mean? Like, I'm under Metropolitan Saba, of the Antiochian Archdiocese, and of course Dimitri's in the Russian Church abroad, and there's just absolutely no but at the same time, like, that doesn't mean that Greek Orthodoxy has nothing to do with like Antiochian Orthodoxy. If anything, the Greeks will have more disdain for Elpidophoros than me because they're actually affiliated with him. That's what I always find, you know what I mean?
Yeah, that's right. It's this harsh balance, and it also affects any considerations of the American Orthodox community in uniting, say, around a single core. Have this big council of bishops which runs the entire thing, similar to the Holy Synod in the Russian Empire. If a certain structure like that was to be formed with various bishops from different jurisdictions, Elpidophoros would have to be part of the equation. But who'd want a guy like that joining in and kind of giving his left-wing takes and probably poisoning the well, so to speak? Of course, one bishop cannot poison the well of an Orthodox synod. So, of course, we even saw the councils of Rokor in 1983. There were some bishops who were clearly more liberal than others, right? During the canonization of all the Russian new martyrs and Tsar Nicholas II, etc., and Saint John of Kronstadt, there were clearly some bishops who were they didn't want to downplay the canonization of Saint Nicholas II and his family, but they definitely tried to lighten the effect of the rhetoric, which was clear that he was ritually murdered, that he was a katekon, etc., that his name should be remembered first in the liturgy when the new martyrs are being commemorated, which in the end that conservative view did win out, which is in fact why we commemorate him first, and then we commemorate the new martyrs, Saint Benjamin, Saint Vladimir, etc., and all the other new martyrs killed under communism. So yeah, so it is possible for both liberals, or I guess more left-leaning progressive bishops, and right-wing bishops to work on the same council. So yeah, but anyways, it's all a message towards the fact that when American Orthodoxy does become more solidified and united around a certain core, which side will hold dominance? Will it be the progressives or the conservatives in the end? Because I doubt the American Orthodoxy will, of course, unite around a single figure. I don't think it'll be a clear transition into a patriarchate or an archbishopric. Where I think it'll have to be a patriarchate in the end after everything, because you can't simply have an archbishop ruling over multiple metropolitans and multiple other archbishops, which their sees are even older than. Say, it would just be a little bit too confusing for both Greeks, Russians, Serbs, Antiochians. So yeah, that's kind of the prospects and the speculative. Yeah,
there's over 1 million of us, and there's a whole. I've been there. The Metropolia of Montenegro. It's a complex and vast network, and obviously it's more concentrated in this little country. But you would need something even bigger than that technically to rule over America, because America has 400,000 plus more Orthodox Christians than Montenegro. So it's a big venture, and I think it's just an interesting discussion in general. I think it's obvious that Elpidophoros is one of the largest impediments right now to Orthodox unity in America, but we see a lot of efforts towards that. We've seen for the first time in decades ROCOR and the OCA Con celebrating at St. Tikhon's Monastery for the feast day of St. Tikhon, and it shows that even though ROCOR is not actually on the Assembly of Bishops anymore due to Goarch's leadership of it, the problem is Elpidophoros and Goarch, not actually ROCOR or the rest of the Assembly of Bishops. Because remember, once Elpidophoros tried to elevate, the defrocked hieromonk Belia, who stole a monastery and parish from ROCOR and tried to join the Goarch's fake Slavic vicariate, he was of course defrocked by ROCOR, and then Elpidophoros tried to make him a bishop, and all the other members of every single other jurisdiction in the U.S. said, we're going to leave the Synod of Bishops, the Assembly of Bishops, if you go through with this, because we recognize Belia's defrocking by ROCOR. And now this has gone all the way up to the Supreme Court, where Belia is challenging, ROCOR's defrocking and all this stuff, which totally violates religious liberty, goes against, the government should not be allowed to come into these church administrations and say whether or not the Russian church should or should not have defrocked this cleric who was forging letters. He literally, he was like making forgeries of letters and all sorts of horrible things. And now, he's gonna unfortunately have his case heard in court, because even Elpidophoros has to almost disavow this guy, because once all of the heads of the Antiochian Church, the Serbian Church, the Romanians, the Bulgarians, OCA, all these people that are all in the Assembly of Bishops, with Goarch, because Elpidophoros is the head of the Assembly of Bishops, they received these letters once they refused to recognize Belia, that Belia was going to sue all of them. And Elpidophoros immediately made him retract the letters, but they had all already received them. So they're like, yeah, this guy's a psycho. We're never going to support him. So it just shows you that, like you said, once Elpidophoros is gone, I think there will be a pretty interesting. We'll probably see some good progress, I think, towards Orthodox unity in the United States.
Yeah, it's very uncanny, actually, the fact that the sort of image of Saint Tikhon being the uniting figure in American Orthodoxy, and then of course him traveling back to Russia to become the patriarch and essentially be the last patriarch who serves in the old Christ the Savior Cathedral before it gets destroyed by Stalin. Because interestingly enough, before in 1923 the cathedral actually gets taken by somebody like Belia in the Soviet Union in 1923, it gets overtaken by these schismatic weirdos similar to the ones Zelensky's supporting, called the Renovationists. And the Renovationists are these Bolshevik-supporting schismatic priests and bishops. They take Christ the Savior Cathedral, and since 1923 until 1931, when the Stalin signs off and it's on the cathedral's destruction, the first cathedral, now, of course, it's been rebuilt. For all those years, the last years of the cathedral, not a single proper Orthodox liturgy was served in it. It was all schismatic, heretical texts read within those walls. So, in fact, it's not really unprecedented that somebody like Belia could steal a cathedral. It's happened before on legal grounds. The renovationists stole St. Tikhon's main cathedral in Moscow from him, and the Soviet government supported it. So the fact that if the U.S. government somehow interferes or supports Belia's case here, I think it'll be almost it'll be very similar to what Zelensky's doing in Ukraine. It'll be very similar to what the Soviets did in the 20s and the 30s, supporting these degenerate schismatics, these weirdos. And of course, all it points towards is that the powers of the world are not pro-Orthodox. The unfortunate case, I guess, it's not unfortunate. It's just the way that it is. Reality. The Orthodox reality calls for us to be aware that there are many enemies, right, in the world. And of course, we have to love and pray for our enemies, but we do have to be aware that they exist and they do not want good things for us, which kind of takes us away from this airy-fairy view that everyone's out here to live in harmony and to support us. No, nobody. We Orthodox people are the underdogs, especially in countries like the United States of America, and we are to be always cautious that we may be either taken advantage of or that something negative may happen to us. We need to pray to God for protection and for Him to, essentially, if He does send these tribulations to us, for His support, naturally.
No, I mean, obviously, as was written by Father Seraphim Rose, in the Platina monks, today in Russia, tomorrow in America regarding the Soviet persecutions. But of course, we have that exhortation from the Athonite saint, Saint Joseph, Elder Ephraim, that someday America will be Orthodox, will be holy, which, I guess those two things do go hand in hand, especially based on what we're seeing in Russia, Romania, Serbia, these former communist countries, and how they've emerged from their persecution as, the bastions of Orthodoxy that they are. So, may it be blessed, of course. But unless you have anything you want to tap us into about this past week or anything going on, Dimitri, we're about ready to wrap it up.
Not really. Just another last story that I saw, very interesting. Happened 2 weeks ago, actually, but only made the news recently because, again, it's Orthodox news in Russia. But the oldest Russian theologian, at least alive at the time, is a famous catechizer, actually, of Orthodox people, famous apologist for the Orthodox faith. Alexei Osipov was congratulated by Patriarch Kirill. He turned 85 years old. And, he's been active since the Soviet years promoting Orthodoxy in Russia, and, of course, reaching 85 years. He's very famous on YouTube. His videos have millions of views overall. He's incredibly charismatic, and he's a very good speaker. He knows the scriptures, the church fathers off by heart. And, yeah, he does have some strange views, but generally speaking, his orthodoxy is quite clear, and he is supported by the church. But Patriarch Kirill grants him this award on his 85th birthday, and funny enough, Osipov comes up to the microphone, and what does he say? They say thank you, and he says, well, firstly, he thanks Holy Father Patriarch Kirill, but then he says, and just so everybody remembers, there is a prophecy said by the Russian elders prior to the revolution that, there'll be a persecution, then there'll be a time with no persecutions, but then persecutions will begin again. Thank you for the award. And he just walks off the stage, and it's just like, okay, so Professor Osipov, so he just says this prophecy to the crowd, to Patriarch Kirill, and walks away. And mind you, he was, I wouldn't even say he's the most conservative Russian theologian at the moment, but he just mentions that. And I'm not sure if that prophecy was pointing towards the persecution in Ukraine or future possible persecutions in the case of, like, civil war in Russia or some other degeneracy or overseas persecutions of Orthodox people. But that was simply something that took place in the last 2 weeks. Very strange, mysterious, but very much in light of, and very much in the genre of what we speak about here in World War Now.
And there's always the long shot of the Chinese invasion of the East. Can never get too careful. But that's a great place to end it with all of that. worldwarnow.substack.com. Everybody, link in the description or the show notes to see everything else. Whether you're on YouTube or on Substack, please give us a like, give us a share. It really, really helps us out. Especially as things really start to come to a head in some of these conflicts. We want to make sure the word is getting out, so send it around. We're on Twitter, WorldWarNow_. I'm on Twitter, GnomeRad. Dimitri's on Twitter at OCanonist. Follow us on Telegram, World War Now Telly. That's TELE at the end of World War Now. Yeah, subscribe to us on YouTube, obviously. We got some articles coming up on the Substack, so keep your eyes peeled. Leave us a comment. Tell us, what you want to hear us talk about on Ether Hour next. We've got some of those episodes coming up talking about communism, orthodoxy, history, among other things, philosophy. So stay tuned for that. Big things coming up. But Yeah, Dimitri, give us a send off.
Thank you, everybody, for listening. Of course, subscribe, support us if you can. It really means a lot to us, and it, of course, perpetuates our creativity as well as the time we can commit to these programs, writings, and for your own benefit. Of course, give us feedback if you have any, and we salute all of you Orthodox Christians. God bless, and of course, keep listening to us, keep supporting us, and we'll keep giving back in the fullest. Thank you, guys.
God bless y'all.